Well, good afternoon and morning. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the U.S. Department of the Treasury's webinar on Capital Projects Fund Best Practices for states, territories, and for the associated states. We appreciate you spending the next hour with us as we provide you with information and guidance to help you submit your Capital Projects Fund grant and program plans. To help you all during the next phase of the CPF grant process, we put together this webinar to review best practices related to the development of your plans. And we will be providing a few examples from states that received awards a few weeks ago. We also have the best practices document that we encourage you to reference when completing your grant and program plans. We have that linked on our webpage, and we'll be sharing that link at the end of the webinar. Just a quick reminder that the content of the information that we're covering today is a summary of the guidance and other reference materials. We encourage you to reference the guidance document and the statute for questions and to make sure that you're completing the grant and program plans as directed. Thank you. So today's agenda includes the announcement of our first 4 states receiving a Capital Projects Fund grant award. We'll then briefly review the eligible uses of CPF grant funds, just as a summary for you all, and then detail several best practices by providing examples from our 4 state awardees. We're going to end with a short Q&A, and we'll conduct that Q&A based on some questions that we received prior to the webinar. And we will give you an opportunity to provide questions in the chat. If we do have time, we'll try to answer those questions in the chat. If we can't get to them while we're here, we will follow up with you. But I would encourage you, if you do have specific questions regarding your approach, your grant plan, your program plan, reach out to your point of contact. Each of you have been meeting with either Dana, myself, Nicolette, or Mo, and that would be the best and quickest way to get your questions answered. A few reminders that we are recording this webinar, so please be aware of that, and then also be aware of our email, our general email inbox, capitalprojectsfund@treasury.gov. We'll post that at the end of the webinar too. It's a good place to send us comments or questions. But before we get started, I do want to invite the Director of the Capital Projects Fund, Joey Wender, to offer a few opening remarks. Joey.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to the rest of our excellent team. I see Jeff and Nicolette are on, as well as Priya and some others. We have an awesome team here that is ready to help and assist all of you. I just want to say in 30 seconds, this is an extremely exciting time. We approved our first 4 states last week, which we'll be reviewing with all of you in the coming slides. And the bottom line is we want to approve more state plans, so we want to put more of this money to work deploying broadband and bringing internet to those who are unconnected. So we really thank all of you. And ultimately, we view this as a partnership between Treasury and every one of your states in order to close the digital divide and connect the unconnected. So with that, I'm going to turn it right back over to Jeff. Thanks, Jeff.
Great, thank you, Joey. So we do want to start with a summary and a review of those announcements that we just mentioned. On June 7th, the Treasury Department did announce our first group of plans approved under the Capital Projects Fund. Those states were New Hampshire, Virginia, West Virginia, and Louisiana. And we have a fact sheet here that we'll share with you, but this gives you sort of a brief overview, a snapshot of how each of these states will be using their funds and how many households and businesses they'll be connecting to the internet. So we're very, very excited, as Joy mentioned, about this announcement and this milestone for our program. The state plans approved in this first group will support broadband infrastructure and are designed upon project completion to deliver reliable internet speeds that meet or exceed symmetrical download and upload speeds of 100 megabits per second. So that's to each household. And we are very excited that we will be connecting close to over 200,000 homes in partnership with those states. This is a big step forward, as I mentioned. We'll review or go over all of the summaries, but just want to highlight a few items here from each of the states. So Louisiana is using 100% of their allocation to connect over 88,000 homes and businesses. They were targeting those locations lacking speeds of 25.3. We especially want to highlight and call out the name of their grant program, Gumbo. Very creative. Love that part of it. They got an A+ on that part of their grant plan. New Hampshire is going to use $50 million, which is a little over 40% of their CPF allocation to connect 15,000 homes, mostly in rural or remote areas. Virginia will be using 100% of their CPF allocation to fund their existing state grant program, VATI, and they'll be connecting over 76,000 households, which represents approximately 28% of the unserved areas in their state. So a big dent in their digital divide. In West Virginia, of course, will use 100% of their allocation to serve over 20,000 locations, which represents a little over 10% of their homes and businesses that lack at least 25.3. So in each state, a significant step forward in progress of closing the digital divide. Just want to mention and highlight some of the press that was generated from these announcements. We had several of the senators representing those states take press calls. Our deputy secretary had also been involved in highlighting a lot of these awards, and we held an event out in Virginia with the state and with Senator Warner. So ended up driving national press too. The AP, Reuters, they all picked up these announcements, and we were very excited about that, and encourage you all to work towards your submissions, and then and we'd love to partner with you and make sure that each of your programs that's funded with CPF money is highlighted, and that people understand the importance of these funds and how they'll impact their communities. So want to go over just a quick recap on the use of the funds, just to get us started here on the meat of our program today. So you've probably seen this slide before, but it's worth repeating that the capital projects funds are, for all intents and purposes, a broadband program. We want to make sure that we carry out critical capital projects that directly enable work, education, health monitoring, including those remote options. We do want to meet the three statutory criteria as laid out by Congress. First, funding must be used for capital assets designed to directly and jointly enable work, education, and health monitoring, as I mentioned. So all three of those activities must be present for an investment to qualify. So you'll probably hear us repeat those three words over and over again, but it is critical that we meet that criteria of the statute first and foremost. Second, the project must be designed to address a critical need that resulted from or was made apparent by or exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. And then third, the project must be designed to address a critical need of the community to be served by it. So these funds are intended to target specific communities with that critical need. To simplify the process for eligible governments, that's states, territories, and for the associated states, we did identify 3 use categories that are presumptively eligible, meaning that they will meet those 3 criteria, meet the terms and conditions of the guidance document. So those are the broadband infrastructure, the digital connectivity technologies, which includes computers, laptops, and public Wi-Fi, and the multi-purpose community facilities. Those facilities should, for all intents and purposes, allow the community members to connect to the internet. So facilitate that connection through computers, laptops, but also provide that internet connectivity. That's really what we're after there. Next slide, I just want to get to the mechanics of completing a grant plan, and I want to emphasize a few key best practices that you should be incorporating into your grant program plans. So Capital Projects Fund was created so that you all could make capital investments in broadband infrastructure and digital connectivity devices. Again, even if we're talking about multi-purpose community facilities, we're talking about the primary objective being getting people connected. We're looking to future-proof these investments. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, as we've all heard, to invest in technologies that will connect our communities well into the future. These need to have a long-lasting impact. That's why we've included a preference for fiber in our guidance, and why we've set the requirement for the design build standard to 100 symmetrical. We also understand that affordability is a key component of closing the digital divide. Even if you have internet service or access, if you can't afford it, then it really doesn't matter that you have access. So we are encouraging the subrecipients of your grant programs, the internet service providers, community service providers, co-ops, they should provide a low-cost option so that families in need can afford the service. Subrecipients of states and territories must require subrecipients providing broadband services to participate in the Affordable Connectivity Program. That's the FCC's low-cost program. If you're not familiar with it, we can help you find out more information about that program. Now, if the design build standard is impracticable to meet, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the best practices section of this webinar, you'll need to commit to a process, describing a process and evaluating those types of projects, how you came to that conclusion. But at a minimum, that network would need to provide 100 down, 20 up, and be scalable to 100 symmetrical at some point in the future. Again, we want to see a menu of options. That's why we've encouraged in our guidance that all types of internet service providers are welcome, including broadband networks owned, operated by, or affiliated with local governments, nonprofits, and cooperatives, or should be eligible entities to any to apply to any RFP or to apply to any state grant program. We know it's going to take a number of different types of providers, large and small, public and private. So we strongly encourage that and would want to see that in your program plans. Another highlight and something else you'll hear today is community engagement or consultation, where we're looking for robust and far-reaching efforts and initiatives. We want to see details on how you sought feedback and engaged with those communities that had a critical need. Then we want to see how that feedback informed your program. So the key component of your plan should be that community engagement, so that we understand that you did reach out and that you took the information seriously, and it informed how you plan to distribute these funds to connect these homes and businesses. So I want to thank you for your time today, and I look forward to continuing to work with you all as you submit your grant and program plans. We will, again, have a Q&A that Nicolette and I will conduct at the end. If you do have questions, please submit them in the chat or the Q&A box. And if we have time, we will also answer those, but we will get to them for sure, and we'll get back to you with those answers. And then finally, just a reminder, yes, we will be sharing these slides. So the slide deck will be made public. We'll post it on our website, and then we'll also make sure that you all have a copy. Now I'm going to turn it over to Nicolette, who will review the CPF's new best practices guide. Nicolette.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I'm really excited to talk through this guide and some best practices with you all today. As many of you know, the CPF team has been working really hard on this guide, and we're hoping that it is a really good kind of linear document that shows the exact steps and the things that are needed at each stage of when you're submitting grant and program plans. And then today we're going to kind of be going over some of those really important best practices that we wanted to highlight as something we've seen as we're reviewing plans right now. So as a lot of you recall, earlier this year, we hosted a similar webinar, which we went through, step by step on how to submit your grant and program plan. And then we provided a few tips throughout the presentation. I highly suggest going back to that. That's on our website as well. If you haven't started the process yet, that's a really good starting place to see just how you navigate the portal and begin this process. Today's webinar is going to be diving in a little bit deeper and not only provide tips for the grant and program plan submissions, but we're also going to provide examples from the 4 successful recipients that Treasury announced earlier this month. So we're really excited to be talking about West Virginia, New Hampshire, Louisiana, and Virginia today, and some of the great work that they did, and that we know many of you are also doing on the back end, but we really want to highlight these first 4 on today's webinar. So first, again, some of this you all have heard, but we really want to reiterate it, is just kind of talking about the grant plan. So the grant plan is the term we are using at Treasury for CPF. It's the overarching proposal that you will be submitting to describe how you plan to use your funds. Each recipient only needs to submit one grant plan. You could submit 5 program plans and you would still only need to submit one grant plan for each recipient. So the grant plan includes an executive summary, the allocation table, and then each program plan that you decide to submit. And also clarifying, some people have preferred, as you'll see with some of our states, to put their entire allocation towards one use. So all for broadband, for example. Regardless of you only submitting one program plan, you would still need to submit the executive summary, allocation, and one program plan. And also another key thing I like to tell a lot of my states is, if you're doing one program plan, say example again for broadband, it may feel a little redundant when you're filling it out because there is some similar overlap in questions between the grant and program plans, but highly suggest just taking the time to fill those out so that Treasury spends less time through the iterative process with you all. And then I want to mention a couple top level things on this slide, and some things that you all should keep in mind when you're completing your grant plan. So first, you all can submit additional documentation that you feel is necessary to respond to questions. Anything that's not listed as a requirement would just be an additional document, and we will consider any relevant documentation that you all submit. Please just make sure when you submit that in your program plan or your grant plan, that you specify what each additional document corresponds to. So if it's answering a specific question, please describe the answer of that question in your actual plan submission, and then say something along the lines of, see attachment, XYZ for additional information or data. That way, Treasury doesn't have to dig around and spend a lot more time asking you clarifying questions. We just know exactly what documents go to which questions. That would be extremely helpful. Second, this is really important, is throughout the entire CPF grant period of performance, March 15th to December 31st of 2026, recipients are responsible for updating their SAM.gov information. So this is especially important for making sure that your UEI, which was previously your DUNS, is active throughout the period of performance. Sometimes we've seen that lapse and those numbers becoming inactive. Just make sure you're double checking that, not only for CPF, but also for other federal grant programs that you're a part of. It will, if they're not up to date, recipients could experience delays in their plan reviews from Treasury or any funding if it goes on long enough. So we want to avoid any issues with that. Additionally, we could share any information from a recipient's CPF grant application, such as their grant plan or program plan, publicly. This does not include any, private information, but it would include things such as the allocation table or program descriptions, and many ways that you're going to see throughout today's webinar. Just some examples we provide from the 4 states that receive funds. And finally, all CPF grant plans, including at least one program plan, must be submitted by September 24th, 2022. So that feels like it's far away, but it is actually just a little over, I believe, 3 months away. So that's a little just a quarter of a year away, but we're really excited to kind of work with you all to get through that. So moving on to the program plan summary. So this is within the grant plan. So it's not as overarching of your entire plan. The program plan is the recipient's request for funding for a specific use. Again, broadband, digital connectivity, multi-purpose community facilities. So these program plans should provide detailed information on a particular program type that you intend to undertake. And so the program plan is going to include things such as, the objectives of the program, the way in which it's administered, how equity and critical needs considered in the program design and implementation, and some other questions that we specifically ask in the program plan. So similar to the grant plan, the program plan includes a short list of things, which is the use code questionnaire, the program narrative, the program budget, and if applicable, the pre-award cost annex. And we'll kind of dive into a little bit or some of these throughout this webinar. One thing I will say is in the best practices document, if you're taking notes right now through this webinar, we do have a section in the best practices document that has little check boxes of what you should include in each. So just as reminders at the top, I believe it's page 3, it says your grant plan should include these 3 things, and then your program plan is to include these. And it's just reminders, having that pulled up, making sure that when you hit submit that you've included all of those things. So another thing on this slide we wanted to highlight is that your program plans do not need to be submitted all at once. We will review submissions on a rolling basis. So if you submit one, for example, tomorrow, and then you submit one in August, we will very obviously start reviewing the one that you submitted earlier first and kind of work through our submissions that way. Program plans can vary in length, but are typically 5 to 10 pages. So this is not a requirement by any means. This number is just to provide you all with some guidance on what previous recipients have done, and what we're seeing so far is an average of 5 to 10 pages. So just keeping that in mind. Again, that's not a requirement, just some people have asked and we wanted to highlight that for you all. And lastly, recipients will be able to revise portions of their program plans in the submission portal, and you should reach out to your Treasury point of contact to begin this process. It might be slightly different for different recipients based on where they are in the process, and your point of contact will be able to start that with you. So moving on to the general best practices and tips to keep in mind when you're going throughout this whole process. So as I mentioned, you all should make sure to reference the best practices guide. We really worked to make sure that every part of our process is in there, and it's a document that we can update as we go. So if you all find that we are missing a key important part and you would like to let us know, feel free to reach out. We want to make sure that that guide really is, the center place where people can go if they're not sure what to do next or where they're at in the process. So excited to kind of walk through that with you all. So first on this slide is we ask recipients when they submit things to provide a detailed timeline and milestones related to administering the program during the period of performance. So one really key thing for this is that it should be at the top level. So at this time, we're asking to see what you as the recipient, so the state, the territory, or the freely associated state, what you all are proposing as your grant timeline. So we're not necessarily asking for each individual project's timeline that you're submitting, but we are asking, you know, for yours, if you're doing, for example, a broadband project, what does your RFP timeline look like? When are you going to start contracting? When are you going to start reviewing those subrecipient applications? So Treasury is looking for your timeline on when you are doing your grant program, whether that be, you know, direct implementation or sub-grant. Second is include an estimated number of locations. So this can be households, businesses, general locations that will be served by the CPF investment. As many of you have seen in our fact sheets for certain states, we do provide this information in each fact sheet once an award has been approved. And we really just want to highlight what these funds will accomplish in your state. And this estimate is going to help us out with that. And it's also going to help show the individuals and the constituents in your state that you all are, you know, making a real investment to a real number of households or individuals. So the next is recipients must describe the financial, managerial, and institutional capabilities that they have. We'll dive into this a little bit more, but you can do this by detailing previous experience managing similar grant programs. For example, we've had some states talk about using their grant structure from the CARES Act funding that they received, or they describe increasing staff to oversee the program. So we've seen several things, but just note that noting that somewhere in your program or grant plan is extremely helpful. Next is where applicable, please provide the following to Treasury. So this is specifically if you're doing a sub-grant program. So if you're doing a sub-grant program, we would request that you provide your sub-grant application announcement, the application itself or the RFP, any scoring rubrics that were used, the subaward grant agreement, and a description of the outreach to the eligible applicants. This is not so that we can monitor you at a project level. This is mainly so that we can ensure that any subrecipient programs that you guys are doing, you set it up in a way that allowed you to choose projects that were eligible based on CPF guidance. So that is the reason for us asking for those. And then if applicable, please list all other federal and state funding streams used to supplement proposed projects. That would also be very helpful. We go back to a lot of recipients asking for that information. And then next is review, kind of on that same topic, review and double check your submitted budgets and funding request dollar amounts. This seems quite simple, but I think something that really halts the process a little bit when we're reviewing is if we're catching budget numbers being off throughout different documents. So for example, if you submit a program plan and the request is, you know, $15 million, but in your grant plan summary, you say that you're going to be requesting 17 million, Treasury will need to go back and ensure, you know, that we have the correct number and that the request itself is cured so that we know exactly how much money is required. And we'll have to go through and double check all documents. So while you're reviewing before submitting, please make sure that your budget numbers across the board are the same. And that is not to say that you cannot provide some estimates, because we understand some projects have not begun and you are estimating based on your best knowledge, but just make sure that those estimates are the same across all documents as well. Finally, on this slide, highlighted in the tip box at the bottom, and also pausing to state that if you all have seen the best practices guide, you'll see these tip boxes throughout the guide. They're really just highlighting, like they are on the slides here, some really important key things that Treasury wants to highlight. But so highlighted in the bottom tip box, recipients are required to publish a description of their process for considering affordability in their project selection process. So we ask that you provide this information in your program plan, and this can be done in a variety of ways. So it can be as simple as including it in your published guidance if you're doing a subrecipient program. It can be on your program website that's publicly available, or et cetera. So please just let us know in your program plan where and when you plan to make this information available. because this is also an area where we tend to go back to recipients and ask for more information and clarification that they're actually going to be doing this. So next, we're going to be moving into some of the meat of today's webinar. So as Jeff really highlighted in his part of the webinar, this is really Treasury's first broadband grant program. And a lot of the plans that we're seeing are broadband focused. So today's webinar is going to have several slides on some tips for broadband projects. And then we will focus on the 1B and the 1C, which is the digital connectivity technologies and the multi-purpose community facilities as well towards the end. But just note that this is where our 4 recipients also receive their funds was from use code 1A, which is broadband grant. And we're going to be highlighting each state on a different slide throughout. And we're really excited and grateful that they were willing to let us share this information today. So this slide, as I mentioned, highlights use code 1A broadband. And so right off the top, as many of you had heard in our one-on-one conversations and other webinars, Treasury's requirement for broadband infrastructure projects, they need to meet or exceed speeds of 100 by 100 symmetrical unless impracticable. This is different than a lot of other broadband programs that are starting or that are already out there. Our requirement does not start at 100 by 20. It starts at 100 by 100. And the only case in which you would be allowed to do 100 by 20 as the bare minimum is where, as a recipient, you show justification that it is actually impracticable to make your speeds hit 100 by 100. And we'll go into that a little bit more, but that can be done in a variety of ways. So as I mentioned, we're going to require any recipient not meeting this speed threshold to develop a process to assess subrecipient project proposals that don't meet the speeds of 100 by 100 megabits per second, so that we can determine whether it would in fact be impractical to deliver the required speeds. So, one second. Sorry, I think allergies are getting to me today. So, factors to consider, just some examples, may include excessive development cost per location or geographic barriers. As I mentioned, this is up to the recipient to provide the data to show Treasury that it is indeed impracticable for these reasons. And you must include specific data sources relied on to develop this process and provide a description of that process. And the example here we're using is West Virginia, one of our 4. So they actually began an extensive data gathering initiative to create a target map area. So this not only showed the areas of need, but it also showed certain things like the lack of ISPs in certain areas, population density levels, and in their case, extremely low density levels and topography. So as many of us know, West Virginia being in the Appalachian chain might have some issues there. And this allowed West Virginia to identify areas where they could prioritize financially and technically feasible projects that would actually still hit these areas of critical need. And it also gave Treasury this hard data that shows area where our standards may be difficult to achieve. So they did a great job of providing all of this information and having data readily available for Treasury when we were reviewing their plan. So this next slide highlights Louisiana. So we ask recipients to describe the process that they followed to address affordability in their project specifications and selection criteria. And as I mentioned, this needs to be published somewhere by the recipient, and it's up to you all to determine how to do that, and we're gonna just ask for proof of that. But in order to do this, Treasury encourages the use of data from surveys, community engagement, and other existing studies, or any other data to determine affordable broadband services for the areas. So for example, you all can cite pricing data or the characteristics of a basic service in the area, latency, non-reoccurring costs, data caps, or whether the application of ACP will reduce the monthly fee to an amount less than the average monthly service fee for that community. For example, as we have here, Louisiana, in order to determine their issues, so they held public meetings in targeted communities to gather feedback and information like this. So in their feedback, they their communities indicated that the residents felt as though the broadband service packages were too expensive and they didn't have many options. And so in order to address this community feedback, Louisiana structured their Gumbo subgrant program, again, a great name, so that the applicant scoring criteria gave additional points to applicants offering low-cost broadband services. So just an example of how community engagement and feedback from the areas of critical need led to the subgrant program actually addressing those needs. And these are the type of things that Treasury is looking for to show that you not only did this community engagement, but that it informed your decisions and your program plans. Next is Virginia, again with broadband infrastructure. So additionally, Treasury requires recipients to provide details about their initial and ongoing community engagement efforts. And ongoing means post-project implementation. So once Treasury approves your project, what ongoing engagement are you all as the recipient going to be doing to make sure that these funds are actually invested in areas of critical need and that the investments are actually going well and helping people and not just baseless efforts? Because as we've said at the top of this webinar, this is a once in a generation investment, and we are really hoping to get it to the communities that need it. So an example of this is Virginia. So they did this in a very interesting way. So they are structured to engage communities by having the actual direct subrecipients of their program be local governments. They are the primary eligible applicants for their subgrant broadband program. And then additionally, their scoring criteria for their subgrant program considers the involvement of local NGOs and community support organizations that are involved in that actual broadband project, as well as any digital literacy or digital equity activities that they're doing. So they do weigh the scores heavy on those who are involved in those activities as well. So another great example of this. And the last of our broadband examples, but not least, is New Hampshire. So finally, Treasury requires recipients to provide evidence of how the critical need in the area that you chose for your investment was assessed and how you determined the lack of access, affordability, or reliability to broadband. So as I've said several times, please list all relevant federal and state data used throughout your planning process. And something that we found extremely helpful for New Hampshire was that in their program plan, they provided a plethora of data that showed the households in the communities that they chose to invest in lacked connection speeds that supported multiple users being online simultaneously or lacked connection at all. Many of us definitely experienced this throughout the pandemic, but New Hampshire provided the data that showed those areas that were hardest hit by that, and they through that data plan to prioritize bringing service to these households through the broadband infrastructure and by bringing more affordable service offerings to support bridging the divide and mitigating the risks of increased hardship. So another great example. And as I said towards the beginning of the call, I'm also going to be reviewing some 1B and 1C. So while this is predominantly a broadband investment program or infrastructure program, we still have plenty of people doing 1B and 1C investments and proposals. So we want to just highlight a few best practices for these projects as they are extremely important as well and things that we're noting when we're reviewing program plans. So a few tips for 1B, which is the digital connectivity technology program plans, that includes the following. So proposed devices in your plans are for public distribution or made available in a public facility. So for example, this could be devices that are acceptable that you all do in a library, for example. So people would be able to go and do a short-term loan program of a device or a long-term loan program of a device in a public facility being a library. So I, as a member of that community, could go in and borrow that device that was invested using CPF funds. Second, ownership of CPF digital connectivity technology devices must be retained by either the recipient or the subrecipient. So this is really important. We ask that you state this in your program plan. I believe there's a checkbox question in the use code template, but really just reiterate that you, or if you're doing a subrecipient program, that those libraries, for example, if those are the subrecipients or those local governments are actually going to be retaining ownership. And if not, and you have subrecipients, but you as the state will be retaining ownership, please note that as well. Next, the program plan should describe the types of digital devices and their uses. So generally we understand that the exact number or exact types of devices may not be known at the time of submission, but please provide reasonable estimates, just like with anything. We don't need, you know, the lot number or whatever the device number is or the exact serial number. We would just love to know that you plan to provide, for example, 20 routers to these communities for a loan program. And that way it gives us a sense of whether the devices you would be investing in are actually eligible under our program. So again, it can be estimates. Please just let us know if they are. And we will at a future point be asking for additional information and making sure that in our reporting phase that these are the exact number of devices. So finally, we ask that you describe the compliance and subrecipient monitoring described in the program plan and how that will be conducted. So this is not only for 1B, it's for all categories, but we've especially found this to be with these digital connectivity technologies, is we're seeing a lot of subrecipient programs, and we would just like recipients to clarify how they will ensure compliance and subrecipient monitoring, because this does tend to be a heavy subrecipient category. So next, moving to 1C, which is the multi-purpose community facilities. So the program plan should demonstrate for a 1C project that it has been designed to ensure investments using CPF funds will jointly and directly enable work, education, and health monitoring. So these buildings have to jointly and directly enable all three: work, education, and health monitoring. So make sure when you're submitting that they do directly hit all three of those. That's something we're seeing. And feel free, if you have questions on whether it would actually hit that first key priority, feel free to reach out to your point of contact and ask for their guidance and see if it's something that CPF would actually fund. So that's a great first step if you are unsure. So the program plan must demonstrate also for these 1C projects that the investment serves a community with a demonstrated community need and the facility is publicly accessible to that community. Next, the program plan demonstrates that the proposed use will be operational by December 31st, 2026. In addition to being operational by the end of the period performance, we ask that the building, it also has to provide services for at least 5 years after completion of the project. And that's at the completion of the project, not at our December 31st operational deadline. Next, recipients should provide assurance that the operations and maintenance costs necessary to operate the project, so the community center, the library, et cetera, past our grant period of performance has been considered and a financial structure is in place to pay those operation and maintenance costs. Note that CPF award funds may not be used for O&M costs. Finally, the program plan should provide assurance to the recipient, or if applicable, the subrecipient retains ownership of the investment. This is really similar to the 1B, but it's at a much larger scale. We would just ask that you provide assurance that you or the subrecipient would retain ownership of this investment. So these are all of the best practices. I know it's been about 45 minutes. It feels like we've hardly scratched the surface, but those are really some major key things that Treasury is seeing when we're reviewing these program plans and grant plans. We highly suggest, like I've said several times, reviewing the best practices guide. It is a great linear document that just walks you through the process and hopefully makes this a lot easier and a lot more digestible, because we understand there's a lot out there. So before we end today, I know our last section is the Q&A section. We received several questions sent to us over the past couple of weeks in anticipation of this presentation. So we're going to be answering a bunch of those as they're extremely important. But we may have a few minutes to answer any questions in the chat. And as Jeff said, if not, we will follow up with you via email. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Jeff.
Great. Thanks, Nicolette. Super. Well, let's dive into a few questions that we did receive before the webinar. The first question we have is, if proposing a sub-grant program, when should a recipient, if that's the state, which it should be, provide the subgrant application announcement, subgrant application, RFP, subaward grant agreement, or any other relevant information to Treasury? Nicolette?
Yeah, great question. We receive this a lot. So the state, territory, or freely associated state, so the recipient here, should provide the information as soon as it's available. However, that doesn't mean you have to wait until your that all of that information is published to submit a program plan. Flagging for us in your program plan that you are working on it, or it will be published after Treasury approves the program plan, is fine. We will just ask once it's available, we will follow up and that you provide that information for us. So it is not necessary to provide upon submission.
Great. Let's go to the next question. How can a recipient describe their institutional, managerial, and financial capability to properly manage and administer CPF funds?
Yeah, so recipients can demonstrate this. I kind of talk about this a little bit throughout this webinar, but you can all demonstrate it by, for example, detailing previous experience managing similar grant programs. The example I used previously were that several states have received similar funding through their CARES Act allocations. So if you have and are basing your CPF grant sub-program off of your previous CARES, that would be a good way of explaining that you have previously done this and have successfully implemented it. If you describe increasing your staff, we know a lot of people are creating broadband offices at the state level. That's a really good way to show that you are expanding, or you can demonstrate your managerial and institutional capability. And then another great way is partnering with outside organizations or agencies for program assistance. We're seeing that as well. And it's very helpful in showing that you all have the capabilities to utilize these funds.
Super. Okay. Our third question is, what information should be included when providing timelines and milestones related to administering the program during the period of performance?
Another great question. I guess before getting into the details, I'll highlight again that we are asking for top-level recipient information at this point. So we're asking what you as the state, what you see as your program timeline and milestone. So for example, that can be when you all release your request for proposals, the publish date, the application deadline if you're doing a subrecipient program, what that application review timeline for subrecipients would be, the award date that you estimate you would grant awards, when you estimate grant agreements would be signed, any construction phases, and then projected project completion and start dates of any subsequent round of applications. Just some like top level examples of where you see the timeline fitting for you all.
Super. Okay, and our fourth question is, how do you update or submit a revised grant plan, budget allocation table, or program plan?
Another great question, because this really depends on the recipient. So you will everyone will need to first contact their Treasury point of contact. So they will assist them based on where they are in the review process. For example, if yours is being currently reviewed right now and Treasury has to pause that review, that would be different than someone who had just recently submitted and hadn't been picked up for review by Treasury. So first contact your Treasury point of contact or the Capital Projects Fund general inbox, and they will get you started on that process.
Great. Well, that wraps up our questions that we received beforehand. We do have a little bit of time, so why don't we take about 5 minutes and see if we can tackle a few questions that came in on the chat. There is a question that's related to question 4 about how we update, and that is from Michael Fleischman from California. How long do recipients have to revise and resubmit their program plans?
Yeah, I think, so for this, you would have, as we said, up until September 24th to submit. You would have until, I believe, December 31st, 2026 to kind of revise portions, but Treasury would need to speak with you all and figure out and improve that prior to it being allowed. And we might have Jeremy Turp coming online to help answer that as well. Or not, he was just unmuted. Good.
Yeah, I think, we would need to talk to you about that. Substantial revisions may be discouraged after the September 24th deadline, but we understand there may be tweaks or changes and adjustments that may be needed to your proposal based on the fluidity of a number of different factors like supply chain and labor and things like that. Budgets may increase or decrease, so we can work with you on that depending on what the request is. The next question came in from David Polish, and there's a similar question from Luciana DiMaggio, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, about the ownership of the facility. And what I'd like to do, David and Luciana, is to get back to you on that. Several of you have reached out to us regarding implications of 2 CFR 200, which is, we short the name to Uniform Guidance, and I think all of you are familiar with Uniform Guidance. If you're not, your state budget offices or those offices that have been handling federal grant funding should be able to answer those questions. But there are some ownership implications contained in that guidance. So what we'll do is take this question back, make sure we get an accurate answer for you, and respond to you via email. Thank you. The next question is, we do have a 1C question, Nicolette, from Brandy Reitner. Is the full construction of a building or just the technology for 1C funding? And I imagine she means for the funding. Can we fund the building, or is it just for the technology?
Wow, that was my first time being muted. Okay, so I think it really depends on the proposal itself. So it's hard to give a one answer fits all. However, if there are, when you're either improving or purchasing or building a multi-purpose community facility, if there are some technologies in order to make the building operational that are ancillary costs, those would be allowable to some extent. But then if you're purchasing for that building, say $10 million worth of laptops, those would need to be a different program plan, because that is a different portion of your allocation rather than just an ancillary cost in order to make the building operational.
Right. We do have a question regarding an existing program that may fit the CPF guidelines. Awards have already been announced, but agreements not executed. Would this program still be eligible CPF? Jody Golden is asking this question. It may be, but the timing will make it a little bit difficult, and depending on when you want to execute those agreements, it may be a little bit longer than you had planned. It's worth discussing with your point of contact for your state, so I'd encourage you reaching out to that person, and we can get a few more details. I think additional details would be needed to fully answer that question, but appreciate the question, Jody. Yes, we will have this recording on the Treasury website. And then Eric is asking about the link to the best practices document, which should be right there on the front page. It might be on the right-hand side, a little bit to the right-hand side on the bottom, but we can put the link in here in the chat for you also. I did get an update on the property questions. So those guidelines should be released soon. We'll make sure to get those out to everyone and send you all an email reminder. So those of you, David and Luciana, that were asking about the ownership of those multipurpose community facilities, we should have some additional guidelines soon. So thanks for your patience on that. Nicolette did post the best practices guide here in the chat. So if you can go into your chat, you'll see the link there, and you can access it there. And if you need help with it, just reach out to one of us and we'll help you find it. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap up here. We have one last question though, Nicolette, on 1C, and that's from Paul Dion. Under 1C, can CPF funds be used to purchase an existing building rather than construct a new one?
I would need to double check, but I believe that that would be okay if they can modify current buildings, then they would be able to purchase, but I would like to follow up.
Paul, we'll get back to you. In the guidance, we do allow for construction to be paid for or the renovation of an existing building. So we did contemplate that. We'll be sure to follow up with you and confirm that response. Well, again, thank you all for joining today's webinar. We hope this information will help you all in submitting eligible projects aimed at ensuring that all communities have access to high quality modern infrastructure needed to access the critical services like broadband. A recording of the webinar will be posted on our webpage, as I've mentioned. We'll also have the slide deck there. If you're not finding these items or if you need additional information, please reach out to your point of contact, either Dana, myself, Nicolette, or Mo. We'd be happy to help you. And those of you that ask questions that we need to get back to, I've written it down. We'll try to respond in due time. But if you don't hear from us, feel free to send us an email. We'll get back to you very, very soon. Thank you again, and have a great day.